there's one other thing that I want to get into, and that is in Paul, the eschatological perspective. The eschatological perspective. And I want to turn, we could look at his letters to the Thessalonians, because it's interesting there how he weaves an eschatological view with specific directives for Christian living and things like this. Here's how we have to live in light of Jesus' second coming and things like this. I'm going to turn to a different text, though, and that's 1 Corinthians 7, which doesn't seem like an eschatological text, but I think that actually helps us a little bit because it's dealing with the mundane. In here, Paul works through matters of marriage and singleness, not in terms of spiritual superiority, but with an eschatological view, okay? We're going to talk about singleness later in the semester, so we'll get into some details there. I just want to pay attention to how he's framing this here, okay? So he gives some preference. He says, I wish all were as I am, and he means single there, but he says each one has its own gift, one of this kind and one of another. And so it doesn't sound like he's talking about eschatology here. He's talking about marriage. He's talking about sexual relations within marriage. He's talking about the choice to be single. He's talking about divorce. We'll look at that in 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 17. He talks about divorce and remarriage and all those kinds of things. And then we get down to somewhere around the middle of the text. And I want to look at especially verses 26 to 31. And I'll back up to verse 25 because he comes back to this question about virgins or those who are single. And he says, I have no command from the Lord, but I do give an opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Paul is saying, it's worth listening to me. You know, I don't have a clear command for all people, all times, and everything, but I have some pretty good advice. And he says then, verse 26, therefore I consider this to be good because of the present distress. It is fine for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. However, if you do get married, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned, but such people will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. Okay, so he's still talking about, this doesn't sound eschatological, does it? In fact, he says the present distress. Is that how it was translated here? The present distress. Scholars differ on what that might have been. I've got a friend, Bruce Winter, who's a Pauline scholar and has done a lot of work on the Corinthian correspondence, and he's argued that it's likely a severe famine that was hitting this part of the world at that time. I've taken that to be likely, but it's not. I mean, there is something to the fact that Paul, that there's some ambiguity there, right? That it might apply to a lot of different situations in life. But he says, because of the present distress, okay, there's some great upheaval, and Paul is saying, I think you should remain as you are. If you're married, don't be loosed from a spouse. In other words, the present distress, whatever it is, isn't cause for divorce. If you're married, remain married. If you're single, don't seek a spouse. You know, because there's a great upheaval, and this is a difficult time to be marrying, having children. And remember, in Paul's world, marriage and children go hand in hand, right? It's not like, well, we can get married. We don't have to have children to take care of. We can just get married. So Paul's got that in mind, and he said this is a difficult time. Okay, so it still sounds like it's present, not eschatological. But here's where it turns. And I think what Paul is doing is he's thinking about this present distress, and now broadening it out, widening it, thinking in much bigger terms, right? And he says, so from now on, okay? So I want to read this, 29 to 31. And I say this, brothers, the time is limited. Now we're starting to see the eschatological there, right? So from now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who make use of the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the world in its current form is passing away. Okay, so there's an enclosure there in verses 29 to 31 where he says the time is short, or I think NASB says the time has been shortened, and in verse 31, the form of this world is passing away. There's your eschatological perspective. So I think what Paul's doing, I want to raise a couple of things here. Excuse me just a moment. Okay, so I think what Paul is doing is he's taking this present distress and now he's thinking in much broader terms about an eschatological perspective. Think about it this way. If a nation is at war or going to war, Paul might say, look, you can't go about life as usual here, you know. This is not the time to be marrying and shoving off to war. It's all hands on deck. It's that kind of thing, right? It's an interesting thing to me that in a lot of you in your generation, the attitude towards war has been quite different. It's almost like, you know, remember very clearly with the war on terror that was declared. And one of the messages was, part of what we'll show them is they're not going to change our lifestyle. You know, we're not going to let it affect us. It was a message of almost like life as business as usual, but we happen to be at war. Very different from other periods in history, right? And I won't comment on whether that's right or wrong, but it does seem to me that if your nation is at war, is at war. It's not business as usual, right? And maybe I did just comment on whether I was right or wrong. I mean, it's just different, so it's something to think about. But here what Paul is doing is taking something like that and then just saying, in light of what we know as believers, in light of the fact that the time has been shortened and the form of this world is passing away, how could it be business as usual, right? Forever for us. Whether the time is really indeed short. Remember I talked in the ethics of Jesus about those who talk about Jesus having an interim ethic, that idea that he thinks it's going to be a real short period so people can live real scrupulously for a short time. A lot of people have done the same with Paul here. The time is short. The form of the world is passing away. It's a short time so you can live like this. You can give up marriage. You can do this and that. But Paul expects it to be a short time. I don't think that's the case. I don't think Paul's expectation depends on whether it's indeed a matter of a few years or a matter of centuries. The reality is that in the birth and life and death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, everything's changed, right? And so the time has been shortened. And I'm going to skip ahead to a quote that highlights this in a different context. But here's what Cranfield says: the parousia is near, not in the sense that it must necessarily occur within a few months or years, but in the sense that it may occur at any moment, and in the sense that since the decisive event of history has already taken place in the ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, all subsequent history is a kind of epilogue, necessarily, in a real sense, short, even though it may last a very long time. That's what I think is going on with Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:29 to 31. So he moves from this present distress to this much broader picture. And if you can understand why you would live differently in this time of great upheaval, of great famine, or whatever that is, now you'll be able to understand a little bit better how we are to live as believers for the rest of time, right? And so I want to go backwards here. And two principles that come out of this, right? One is living with the end in view. Living with the end in view. The time has been shortened. The form of this world is passing away. Christians will always live our lives with the reality that Jesus will return one day. And we have hope in that, and in Jesus establishing his kingdom in fullness, right? So living with the end in view, and secondly, living with a sense of detachment. This is how Christians ought to live our lives. So you notice what he says. It's really quite radical, his words. I say this, brothers, he's talking about singleness, but he's going to go beyond that now. The time is limited, so from now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none. That's kind of radical words. What does he mean? Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. And those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. And I think that last statement covers all of it, really. Those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. It's not that Paul is saying that we should not have wives or husbands, that we should not weep, that we should not rejoice, that we should not buy, and we should not use things of this world. But we will do all those things differently, because they're all secondary compared to being found in Christ and called into his kingdom. So those who weep will weep as though they did not weep. What does that look like? Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. And I think, we start to see those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. As I say, I think those statements teach us about what Paul is getting at there. You can buy, we must buy, right? You can use the things of this world, but don't be so invested in them. It's not the end all and be all, I mean, you may or may not have a nice car, but don't have to have a nice car, Don't have to have the newest and biggest and all the bells and whistles, and I know that temptation. I happen to drive a 2-year-old car. It's hard for me to get rid of one because it's been so faithful and I love it, and I've had it about 15 years longer than I've had any other car or something like that. But the other thing is because it was born or made in 1996, same year as my daughter was born. And I just think, I'm not going to get rid of my daughter. How can I get rid of my car, And this thing is just, it runs so well. It's starting to make a little more noise than it once did. But it still works, It gets me back and forth to the seminary and other engagement. It's got 240-some thousand miles on it. I'll take it to Minnesota tomorrow if I need to. I'm not worried about it making there. Now, I will say, when I travel sometimes, I have to rent a car where I am, and I get in a brand new car. Southern has a contract with a certain car company where you walk down the Emerald Aisle, which might give away which car company that is, and you just pick the car, and it's like, I just get to pick one, And a lot of times, they don't care if you go to a whole nother line, or if I've been in there where I'm walking and thinking, and all I'm thinking is, wow, I've got an amazing amount of choices here. And when I'm walking back and forth just to see what the options are, someone will think that I'm a customer who's just not happy with these limited options. That's not what the case is. But they'll go, do you want something in this aisle? Like even nicer? Sure, And I get into these cars, and I just think, this is amazing. It runs so quiet. I remember I was teaching, traveling and teaching every week one semester, where to save money, actually, it was cheaper to rent a car and instead of mileage costs and stuff like that. And so I had a car each week going down for one day, and I'm driving down. My phone's on Bluetooth. I'm talking to my wife without having anything hooked up to me, and I'm just thinking, this is glorious. It's just a nice conversation, like she was right here. And then, the next day I'm back in my car going, oh, this is kind of a dud, actually, The thing that was perfectly fine for me So I did a thing that exhibits incredible hope, right? This was a couple of years ago when my car was, I think, 17 years old, after I had driven these. And I actually had started thinking, maybe I should get a new car, you know? And then I thought, what, I'm going to spend $15,000 or $20,000 so that I can be on Bluetooth? That's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? And then it hit me that all I need to do is get a new radio. And so you talk about hope in a car that at the time was 16, 17 years old, and I'm investing $300 into a new radio that has Bluetooth, but that's what I did. And now I can talk to my wife while I'm driving, and I'm still in my 1996 Toyota. It's a glorious thing. And as an aside, I had offered, you know, thought that my son, who graduated in 2008 from high school, my car was 12 years old, I thought, you know, maybe this would be a good car for you in college, and he didn't think so. You know, my son, who graduated in 2011 from high school, same thing. I thought, this might be a good car for you in college, you know, and now it's 15 years old, and he said, I don't think so. My daughter, who graduated in 2014 from high school, also not interested. And every one of those offers that I made, which was really, I wasn't even sure I was ready to part with it. You know, it wasn't like I was saying you can have it. I was just thinking maybe we could make a deal here. And my youngest son was privy to all those offers. And when my daughter turned it down, now he was like 13, 14 years old. And he goes, I'll take it, Dad. And I said, bless your heart, son. This is my beloved son. And he's still interested in it. He's 17 now, he's driving, and he drives it. And he just asked me if I could do one thing, and that is replace the speakers, because they're all warped and terrible sound and everything. And so I thought, now that'll be real hope if I spend another $200, $300 on speakers on this thing. I'm a little off point here, but the thing is, it's easy to get so invested in the things of this world. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons why I haven't traded it in, I haven't gone for a new car, is because I want to not care. I don't not care, because I've gone shopping with each of my kids for cars, and they've got used cars, and each time I'm like, wow, this is great. Or when I rent cars, those are the kinds of things. I don't believe in going, you know, sort of window shopping. I don't believe in like, hey, let's go shopping. Like, do we need something? No, let's just go shopping. No, because all it does is it incites in me things that, oh, I need this. It's so easy to be attached to things. Get me in a sporting goods store. Other things, doesn't matter. Sporting goods store. Since I was a kid, it's just like everything in there. It used to be a new baseball mitt, you know, a new baseball bat. Now I've just kind of gotten down to golf balls, golf clubs, that kind of stuff. But if I don't go, I'm fine. And I want to live detached from this world. You know, I want to be able to live in a house that it's just fine. I'll go home tonight and I sleep in a comfortable bed, and we've got heat and cooling, and you know, and Paul's getting at that. Live with a sense of detachment. And when I get a new car, because I will have to one day, I'll be great with that. And so I'm not arguing that you shouldn't have things. I'm just pointing out what Paul is saying. When you buy, don't be as though you possess. Hold things lightly, right? Because that will help us also, I think, to be more generous with people, right? It'll help us to be more frugal when you use the world, not as though you made full use of it. And so that's the eschatological perspective, living with the end in view and living with a sense of detachment.